Good afternoon, good evening to everyone. Thank you for joining the iPrivate Law series. We are recommencing this academic year. It's nice to see some faces, familiar faces of people who joined last year and are engaged with this series. So thank you for being here as well. As from this year, the series have a fixed date, which is the last Thursday of each month at 6 p.m. So every month at 6 p.m. we are reconvening. Today we have the pleasure of having Helen Eenmaa and Maria Schmidt-Kessen, who will be presenting the paper that was announced. In November, we will have Caterina Schiaglia from Scuola Superiore Santa Anna. She will be speaking about EU copyright. And in November, we will have Professor Solène Rowan, who has now joined University of Oxford, and she will be speaking about abuse of rights in English law, but also she will make comparisons with the civil law. Okay, so this is the forthcoming events that I want you to have in mind, and we will be very happy to host you again. So without any further ado, I will give the floor to my colleague, Guadalupe Martinez, who's also co-organizer of the series, together with my other colleague, Argiri Panesi. Nice to see you, Argiri, as well today. And she will be moderating today the session with Helen and Maria. Thank you.
Thank you, Francisco, for the opening remarks. Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone. And thank you for joining us this evening. It's a pleasure to have you all with us. And before I introduce our guest speaker, I would just like to mention that we are planning around 30 minutes presentation. And then the idea is to follow with the discussion and questions. And so if you have questions, you can raise your e-hand, or you could write questions in the chat, whatever you prefer. So let me introduce now our guest speaker. We are very pleased to have today Helen Eenmaa with us. And Helen, welcome. Helen holds a doctorate in law from Yale Law School. She is the founder of the Information Technology Law Research and Study Program at the University of Tartu, and a recognized representative of this field in Estonia. In 2008, Helen was an elected member of the Estonian Young Academy of Sciences, and Helen leads law and economics and technology law tracks in the European Joint Doctorate in Law and Development, and has an extensive experience in teaching moral and legal philosophy as well. Today, she will present her paper, her co-author paper with Maria José Schmidt as well. I understand she will join us as well, entitled Machines. Hello, welcome, Maria José. Machines that make and keep promises, lessons for contract automation from algorithmic trading on financial markets. Maria José, Helen, welcome, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Guada. It's really wonderful to be here, and thank you for the invitation. It's a good opportunity for us to workshop this paper. And I'm so glad that Maria José Schmidt-Kessen has joined me here, because she's one of the co-authors of the paper. I also see Maya Mitre in the audience, and she's the third co-author of the paper. I also see other familiar faces in the audience. Marta, it's great to have you. Marta is part of the IT law program in Tartu. And I see Florian as well, who is part of the Contract Automation Society. Maria and I are also part of, and that's something that's launching now this fall. So I'll be able to mention a couple of more things about that later on. But I think let me just start with talking about the paper, which is the sort of the central focus today. And let me share the screen with you. So hopefully you see the presentation now. So the plan is the following. I will tell you why we are talking about contract automation and what discussion we are participating in with that. I will make it clear what the aims of this talk are and what could be your main takeaways from today. And then I will proceed with explaining the content of our work based on those aims. At some point, Maria will take over from me, and she will bring some wonderful examples to illustrate the conceptual framework that I will be explaining to you. So we plan that this will take about 30, maybe 35 minutes, but hopefully there will be plenty of time for discussion as well. So the work is based on this paper, and you see the authors here, and you have probably all seen the front page because the link was also posted with this talk. If you haven't, don't worry, because we will go over the argument, although not exactly in the same structure as the paper is, but you will see for simplification why we won't go over all the details. So why do we talk about machines that make and keep promises? So there is an unreflective criticism against contract automation. We feel that it's unreflective. And this props up the view that we would do better without automating contracting. And that's the basic idea, right? So there is this criticism, and the criticism is that smart contracts and more generally automated contracts are inflexible. And this means that they face a dilemma, like a fatal dilemma in a way. Either they are unimportant or they have limited applicability. And I will explain that further. But that's basically the problem setting of the talk. So the aims of this talk is to examine this criticism by explaining what its content is, by questioning it, and then by applying transaction cost economics to studying it, and then applying the case study of financial markets to studying it as well. And after that, we will list some implications of this for the automation of contracting. There will be 4 points of this talk, which you can hopefully take away afterwards. The first is that the inflexibility of contracting algorithms is considered a drawback, and it's high time to re-examine that. Secondly, the inflexibility of contracting algorithms has a dualistic nature. We can detect it on the level of transactions and at the level of markets. And I will explain that, of course, further. Thirdly, on financial markets, the regulation addresses only one type of inflexibility, not both types, which is significant when trying to understand why and where inflexibility of automated contracts is a problem. And fourthly, all the above aligns with economic theory. So we have confirmation for the conclusions that we're making in the paper also from fundamental economic theory. Now, I already told you about my co-authors, but I also want to mention in terms of context that this is the third in the series of papers that we have written with Maria José. The first was in the beginning of 2019 on creating markets in no trust environments. And the comments on that paper actually propped the discussion for this paper. And the second paper came out at the end of 2019, and it was on smart contracts reducing risks in economic exchange. We use the term no party trust there. But the work in terms of context is also part of the Contract Automation Society, which I mentioned, and which is funded by the Estonian Research Council. So it's a project on algorithmic contracting and computable contracts, which Florian Edelberger and Maria José are part of. And of course, we will be growing the team as the time goes on. And also, hopefully, this paper also feeds into a course which we will be teaching together with Ajiri at IE Law School towards spring. That's going to be on practical AI, computational methods for law. And of course, both the title and the content, and that might all shift and change before spring comes, but this is the general idea, and Maria José, Florian, I, and Ajiri are part of that course, so stay tuned for that as well. Now, let's go to the aims of the course, and let's start with the first one, so explaining the content of the criticism. So how did we get here? This work came to life due to a comment from a computer scientist, Marlon Dumas, who's a professor at the University of Tartu. And he read the paper which Maria and I wrote in 2019 on creating markets in no-trust environments. And that paper explained how contract enforcement mechanisms match up with different trust relationships in these contracting systems. So Marlon came from the context where he saw that smart contracts are generally presented as a tool for decentralizing contracting. And for example, they were seen as carrying out the promise of eliminating dispute resolution mechanisms that typically accompany traditional contracts. And the pro-smart contracts literature presented the idea that smart contracts could be able to execute and finalize transactions in a manner that conventional contracts cannot do. Of course, in our paper, we pointed out that smart contracts are inflexible, and this is one of the mechanisms by which they can finalize transactions. But Marlon's worry was that we had not addressed that to a sufficient extent. His worry was that the smart contracts were inflexible to the extent that they cancel themselves out, basically. So we took his remark, just as you see it here, and we developed it into a big, sophisticated challenge against smart contracts and automated contracts in general. In the spirit of good old philosophical argumentation tradition, we just wanted to debate with the strongest possible counter-argument, so we built it. And let me tell you what criticism we built based on Marlon's comment. But before doing that, let me explain what smart contracts and other types of automated contracts are and what inflexibility means. So what you see in front of you is a graph which shows how many different ways in how many different ways contracting can be automated, and what a rich terminology there is concerning automation of contracting. So this graph was made by Florian Edelberger, and I think he wants me to say that that's still work in progress. So he's working on the next iteration, and it's definitely not final, and maybe I shouldn't even share it, but I just wanted to show you the richness of the vocabulary in that field. And well, stay tuned for the next iteration of the graph. It's not been published, but yeah. So I just wanted to use it to define two terms which I will be using here. First is smart contracts, and that's an executable code. So when specific conditions are met, it triggers a follow-on action. And these encoded instructions do not necessarily amount to a legally binding agreement or contract. As you see on the graph, they really take on only the smallest circle. So these smart contracts can be used to automate the execution of binding contractual conditions, but they themselves do not have to amount to a contract. Very often they are associated with a specific infrastructure technology, which is blockchain. But it's important to see that there are many other advanced forms of contract automation that require little or no human involvement, and they might not require centralization of transactions either. And the automation might concern any or all stages of contract lifecycle. So to point to these varieties of contract automation, I will use the term algorithmic contracts. Lawrence Schultz, for example, has defined algorithmic contracts as contracts that contain terms that were determined by an algorithm rather than a person. And we will use that term later when we talk about financial markets, which is where this type of contracts are most relevant. So smart contracts are inflexible, but the same considerations really regarding inflexibility extend to algorithmic contracts more generally. We can automate some or all stages of a contract lifecycle. So potentially from search and drafting to performance and enforcement. And when we do that, we are limited in our options to adjust or modify the contract later. And even if some intervention functions are included in such contracts, they are also inflexible because they also have to be envisioned by the coder beforehand. The problem that arises is really twofold. It's challenging to consider all the variabilities of everyday life and include them in a contract. So building such contracts is a challenge, but also additionally, it's very costly to write contracts in code. And the problem of inflexibility leads to a criticism. So the criticism is that it's really impossible for smart contracts to handle that dilemma of inflexibility. Either such contracts have only limited applicability, or they are just marginal development in contract automation. The limited application argument, together with the limited efficiency argument, make up the first leg of the dilemma. According to critics, if you stick with the inflexibility, this means that the range of application scenarios for such contracts is really minimal, and contracting efficiency is very low. These contracts would just not be applied. And the second leg of the dilemma is about the marginal innovation argument. So the critics say that, well, you could make smart contracts or algorithmic contracts more flexible to give them more applicability. But this could be done by setting up a system of oversight on top of an automated contracting platform. And the problem is that this really seems to defeat the original purpose of smart contracts, to be tools of disintermediation. And if you set up a system of oversight, then smart contracts would just be an evolutionary step on top of electronic data interchange. So this would be really a marginal innovation. And if the critics are right, then smart contracts could not really be a path for optimizing contracting and gaining benefits from their application in the society. So the criticism seemed intriguing for us, and we wanted to explore it further. It appeared that the claim that something is inflexible was not sufficient to claim that something could not be employed at a large scale. And it seemed to us worthwhile to discuss the matter of inflexibility by asking, what would a rational actor choose to do? In other words, we decided to explore the topic of inflexibility with the tools of rational choice theory, transaction cost economics, and economic analysis of law. Mainly because they also discuss various ways in which limiting or constraining action can help individuals pursue more significant benefits that would be available to them without such constraints. And we wanted this not to be a merely theoretical exercise. We decided to look at the practices of financial markets because we saw potential empirical evidence there against the critics' claims. Financial markets have a long-standing and broad experience with automating transactions. And we wanted to explore how this had been done, so what made it possible, and hopefully learn from it something for the emerging algorithmic contract markets. To explore and question the criticism, we wanted to ask what exactly is the subject of this criticism and what kind of inflexibility we do need to evaluate. One of the points we make in the paper is that inflexibility comes in two forms. First, there is the inflexibility of algorithms that are being used in an individual transaction. And secondly, there are the systemic risks that arise on the market because of employing algorithms and affecting various market participants. And there's also a difference between evaluating these different kinds of inflexibilities. In the first case, you would evaluate the inflexibility of automated contracts. And in that case, we talk about automated transactions that impose a set of architectural limitations on the possible choices. So computers can perform only the tasks that have been previously envisioned. And this is the kind of inflexibility that would be evaluated. In the second case, you would be evaluating inflexibility as a hypernym for systemic risks that arise on the markets because of many actors employing algorithmic contracting. And what would be such risks? Well, the risks would occur because of lower human involvement, because of higher speed, because of interdependency between many automated environments. And there are many questions that the distinction now between those two kinds of inflexibility helps to ask. First, do all kinds of inflexibilities fall under the criticism which Marlon proposed? which type of inflexibility has the regulation targeted on financial markets? And thirdly, would the same approach that financial markets have taken be appropriate for steering the design and regulation of algorithmic contracts, so that their inflexibility would be an advantage rather than a disadvantage? And obviously now the next step is applying transaction cost economics to studying it. In the paper, we built a conceptual framework on two perspectives: rational choice-based theory of constraint maximization, and secondly, the ideas from the field of new institutional economics. The theory of rational choice explains how when we have various constraints, the behavior of actors is a constant process of optimization. And institutional economics tells us how various institutions influence market results and steer a party's cooperation and economic growth. Now, the word constraint is central here. Both rational choice theory and institutional economics are useful for understanding how constraining behavior or limiting options for individuals can help pursue societal goals. And algorithmic inflexibility is also a constraint. It's a constraint in the sense that it limits action, just like legal norms do, like physical barriers do, like software architecture related boundaries do. When you think about a city architecture is not usually there to restrict movement, but to enable it. And in a similar manner, contracting algorithms are not necessarily there to limit action, but to enable it in a specific way. But at the same time, they also do constrain action, just like city architecture does. And that said, nothing rules out, of course, the instrumental use of such constraints or limitations. So you could have constraints and put them in place, like institutions, social norms, and other mechanisms for coordinating individual action. For example, you could use limitations, rules to level the playing field, to pursue some societal goals, but maybe not to be too abstract. If we ask how do constraints work, let me walk you through this with the help of an example. And then use an example of climate change, which I think everybody relates to today. So the conclusions of this example on climate change would be very similar to those when we discussed operational markets. So dealing with the climate change is like a textbook example of the problem of collective action. And it's helpful to look at it through three lenses: the tragedy of the commons, rational choice theory, and economic analysis of law. These help to say something useful about both the problem of climate change and the solution, potential solution. The tragedy of the commons means that a community has a shared resource, like a piece of land, and it's depleted because people tend to overuse it in their own interest. The results of an overexploited resource is not in anyone's long-term interest. Rational choice theory helps to understand why this is the case and how the best long-term results could be achieved in such cases. And the key to the solution is cooperation and low transaction costs. So if you think about transaction costs first, if there is no time, no trust, no information, then collaboration is too expensive for an individual. And these conditions can be improved. So one option is to use regulation to bring down transaction costs in the right place and to create conditions for better communication among individuals. It would also be possible to use regulation for securing cooperation that would be useful for the individual members. Rational choice theory delivers the idea that a rational actor would forego immediate benefits for securing cooperation, which is in his long-term interest. In some circumstances, it's in our long-term interest to adopt the rules that constrain our actions. So if you think about the context of climate change, we know that courts have been able to restrict our freedoms to prevent environmental damage for a long time already. But the fact is that in the changing reality, greater immediate restrictions on our freedoms are becoming proportionate and justified in the interest of long-term preservation of healthy living environment and the ability to exercise our freedom. Just thinking about John Stuart Mill's idea that my freedom ends where your freedom begins, when you include time into the thinking about freedom, you might rephrase the idea in connection with climate change that my today's freedom ends where my long-term freedom begins. And so, of course, climate change is just one example of the problem of collective actions, but markets experience the same. There is a strong parallel in applying rational choice theory to climate change and algorithmic contracting. We talked about constraints, and the inflexibility of algorithmic contracts is also a constraint. It limits action. As we saw with the case of climate change, in some circumstances, constraining self-interest is in each person's rational interest because it helps to secure benefits. And constraints can bring greater benefits than not constraining self-interest. This is the idea with the use of inflexibility as well. You could think of the first type of inflexibility as possibly something like property rules, which is the fundamental characteristic of an environment that make the functioning of an algorithmic, financial, or another type of market and collaboration possible. You need property rights for a market to operate. And individuals are willing to internalize the cost of using inflexible algorithms because it just helps them to secure the gains that they could get from participating in an algorithmic market. At the same time, you could think of the second type of inflexibility, the systemic risks that arise on the market because of employing algorithms, as a structural problem that individual actors cannot solve, and thereby they need something of an intervention, for example, in the form of regulation to help them overcome the systemic risks. So, for example, regulation in response to the systemic risks can provide safeguards which protect weaker parties or level the playing field. And it can deal with the externalities from the system as a whole. So now, based on this conceptual framework, we wanted to see what does the empirical material from financial markets tell us about the theoretical conclusions we made when studying the criticism from the perspective of rational choice theory and institutional economics, and what kind of inflexibility is at the center of attention in the financial markets. And there is also a good reason for drawing a parallel between algorithmic trading on financial markets and advanced contract automation. Algorithmic trading is an example of advanced contract automation. Trade on financial market is a contract in the legal sense. To address the criticism regarding inflexibility in advanced contract automation, it seemed helpful for us to see how financial market regulation has dealt with the inflexibility of algorithmic and high-frequency trading, and to ask whether it addresses inflexibility as a constraint on the level of transactions, on the level of individual transactions, or on the level of markets. So on the level of markets, inflexibility would be the hypernym for the factors like high speed and low human involvement and so on. And that gives rise to the systemic risks. So what did we find? In the case of financial markets, we can talk about the long history of algorithmic trading. And there are many aspects of algorithmic financial markets that give rise to systemic risks. And it's more even the case now that, of course, over the years, algorithmic trading and the techniques have become more sophisticated and the market has become intensified. We had a very productive exchange with Clara Martins Pereira on this, and many of the general characteristics of the current environment on financial markets is a result of both Maya's very sophisticated work on financial markets, as well as the discussion with Clara Martins Pereira. So the cyber and systemic risks on the markets arise because of the very nature of algorithmic trading, we understand. Algorithmic trading is automated, disintermediated, and it's faster than manual trading. Both the investment decisions and execution algorithms are more vulnerable to machine-driven errors and biases than manual trading. And humans are unable to intervene in real time if any algorithm should malfunction. So when we talk about systemic risks, we can, for example, talk about malfunctioning algorithms causing a strain on venue infrastructure, absorbing liquidity, and spreading the risks quickly to the sphere of other market participants across markets. And this can lead to flash crashes or brief episodes of extreme volatility or temporary collapse of a market. And this is what the regulation has tried to avoid. Of course, regulators themselves have been interested in automation in the markets, because that's in a way bringing objectivity to the markets and replacing the subjectivity of humans and their likelihood of making mistakes. But at the same time, it's interesting that when we look at the regulation on financial markets that employ algorithmic trading, the regulatory initiatives have primarily focused on systemic risks arising from the use of algorithms. When it comes to the inflexibility on the level of transactions, regulators have not addressed that to a significant extent. So it was interesting to see that the case of financial markets really supported our conceptual distinctions. That between two types of inflexibility, it makes sense to make the difference, and that it may also make sense to correlate the regulatory responses with the two types of inflexibility. So while parties' actions have been constrained by the inflexibility of algorithms on the level of individual transactions, this has not been at the center of regulatory measures. And at the same time, the second type of inflexibility, that is the systemic risks resulting from the employment of algorithms, has been something that the markets have not been able to manage without appropriate regulatory interventions. And this also aligns with economic theory, as we know it from Pigou, from Coase and others. And I was actually very happy when we got a review on our paper, and the reviewer said that, well, this is perfectly in line with the theory as he knows it. So as the reviewer said, the standard recommendation of economic theory is that if algorithmic inflexibility creates costs for the agent who is using the algorithms, this does not call for regulation. That's because the agent who is using the algorithm internalizes these costs and takes action to avoid them. By contrast, when using an algorithm by one agent creates costs for another agent, for other agents, for example, because of coding errors, can lead to flash crashes, there is an externality that market forces might fail to address. And in this case, regulation may be necessary. So this means basically that distinguishing the two types of inflexibility in algorithmic contracting and respective regulation on financial markets is in line with economic theory, which says that externalities call for regulation, but private costs do not. I think this is a good place to pass the floor now to Maria, because she's able to share some graphs and stories with you, which relate to that final conclusion. Maria, would you like to share your slides?
Yes, absolutely. I just suggested to, if there are already questions, because this has been very much the theory that we've worked with in the article, and now I really come just with some real life examples. So if there are any questions about the theoretical part in itself, maybe we could take them now, Guada, if that's okay. Yes, I see Leon.
Yeah. Yes, thank you so much, Maria. I think it's a great idea. Leon.
Although I think while people are thinking about the questions, perhaps your graphs and your stories might actually invigorate the discussion as well, because of course the conceptual framework is quite dense.
But I'll just take 7 minutes, so no worries. I think we can take a couple.
Yes, I think Leon, you can.
Okay, thank you.
Ask, yes.
I'm sorry that I'm with the mask, and I hope that I am very clear, although I'm with the mask. The first question is that you, first of all, thank you for the paper. I really enjoyed it, and mainly I enjoyed the construction of inflexibility as a constraint on private parties' conduct. My first question is, if the distinction between inflexibility in the private parties field and in the public field is correspond to the difference between social cost and private costs, so the difference between private costs and externalities, what is your main value, what is your value of what is the additional contribution of the paper? Because in my view, the paper mainly rearrange argument that we already know and share from the literature of Pigot and Cause. And my second question is, you mainly focused on the research of Oliver Williamson on organization and new institutional economics. I'm not in economics, but I'm a bit familiar with the literature of new institutional economics. And the research of Williamson is mainly focused on understanding the cost in organization and in long-term contracting. He mainly focused on opportunism in organization. So if Williamson is mainly focused on long-term contract, I am a bit concerned that there is a tension in with incorporating his studies in your paper, because your paper is mainly focused on short-term contract and not in long-term contract. And Williamson mainly focused on organization and long-term contracting and the costs that are expressed in opportunism of the parties. And my last comment, that it's not so important comment, but you may want to consider it, is that there is a very beautiful paper of David Hoffman in Minnesota Law Review that recently published that shows that from the perspective of the parties themselves, inflexibility could be harmful and not necessarily beneficial. Thank you again for the paper.
Many thanks for this question. So could you repeat the third point in terms of the new paper by Hoffman? So what is the point?
The new paper is of David Hoffman in the Minnesota Law Review.
Sure. So I'm not familiar with the paper, but that sounds very interesting. So I'm not able to comment on that. Maria, no. maybe you can. But I would start with the first question, which is what is the contribution that we are actually making with the paper? So what's very interesting when we read about inflexibility in terms of algorithmic contracts is that they don't make the distinction between two types of inflexibility. It was actually true that in our initial discussions, we did not make that distinction either. We were focused, just like many other papers, on the systemic risks. And we considered that main type of inflexibility when we were discussing among ourselves. But then we saw that there is a need for the distinction because, of course, transactions themselves are inflexible when you use algorithms. And actually, when you constrain action, that has significant implications for how much one has contracting freedom. What is an obligation in a contract which is fully automated? So it raised fundamental questions about the values of contracting. That's something that we address in the paper, but I didn't discuss it now in this talk. But by making the distinction between two types of inflexibility, we were able to address both the values of contracting and to sort of enrich the literature on the discussion on inflexibility and to show that some types of inflexibility in automated contracting are not something that regulation needs to possibly address. So at least we threw this up in the air. It's worthy of discussion whether the second type of inflexibility, which financial markets have not addressed, should be addressed on the automated contracting market, because of the restrictions of contracting freedom and various values of contracting. But it's a discussion we're not entering in this paper. It's hopefully something for the future. This paper's purpose is to draw the distinction and show how regulators have responded so far to the problem of inflexibility. In terms of Williamson, I think actually here is a good place to hand over to Maria, because the part on new institutional economics is something that Maria focused on most among the three of us.
And I think I'll address that actually when I present. So maybe we can take it just in a second.
Sure.
But yeah, thank you for your question, Leo. Indeed, that's what every economist asked actually that read that paper. So
thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. This has absolutely been a fascinating initial introduction. I'm not academically oriented as far as this particular subject is concerned. I chair the CFA New York's Asset Owners Council. We're a group of institutional investors, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, and insurance companies. We are currently drafting, with the assistance of DLA Piper, the law firm, a model law for institutional investor public partnerships. So it's analogous to the PPP legal and regulatory framework for the private sector and governments, but we are drafting one that is directly for institutional investors, asset owners, pension and sovereign funds, to be able to work directly with governments as part of our contribution towards COP26, the big climate change agenda, because we've identified two major issues. One, that the governments expect us to mobilize substantial pools of capital at scale. But the importance and the reason why we've actually embarked on this model law project is because we have to be able to deploy that capital at speed. Now, the challenge we have with the PPP legal and regulatory frameworks is something in the industry that we call signature risk. And the signature risk is if there's been a procurement for a large project, and we're looking at projects that have import to the pathway to net zero. So that they are projects that are build resilience and are helping the whole decarbonization process. Now, we currently sit with this signature risk issue, which basically means a government would have put out a procurement process for a particular project. That particular procurement process has been met on all levels by the bidders, if you like, for the projects to finance the project and to operate the project, depending on whichever regime it is. But then after spending those millions of dollars preparing and bidding for the projects and even being awarded the projects, in theory, governments do not sign the agreements, the power purchase agreements or the concession agreements, and then the contract has to be reissued. The whole bidding process has to be reissued. And we know that that is in stark contradiction to the need for speed to be able to tackle climate change in terms of mobilizing investment for projects. So we would like to be able to automate the procurement of the project process. That's why I'm fascinated and interested in any potential analogies to use your approach, so that we could almost program the algorithm to be able to run the entire procurement process and then expedite the award of the project, so that we could address that speed issue. So I'd be very interested to know if your work and your theories only really apply to the traders, the algorithmic trading space, or whether it could be applied, because as we draft this law, we have to address the need for speed. So we'd love, if possible, to be able to incorporate a recommendation or a pathway that talks about the potential context of digitizing or automating the contractual procurement process around the award and the issuance of a contract that has net zero implications? It could be for anything really, but maybe that's what your next speaker will address. But I just thought at this point it would be interesting to see if I'm completely on the wrong track. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a great comment, and I'm glad to hear, of course, that algorithmic contracting could be viewed broadly and useful broadly. There are many initiatives in the US and elsewhere in the world in terms of developing actually computational contracts. Mainly they are now focused on the sector of insurance, I understand, beyond financial sector, but I mean, in terms of framing why that could be useful to do and why, I mean, framing that would be a good idea. But I think, Maria, you were also going to mention some examples in terms of cryptocurrency exchanges and the like, which go beyond financial markets and could be good examples in terms of using contract automation more broadly. So thank you for this comment. Now I see that there are some questions, comments in the chat as well, but do we want to take more from the floor?
I think maybe, Maria, you want to present.
Sure.
We have 15 minutes. Yeah.
Exactly. So
I think it would be good.
Yeah. And I will probably address also Hubert's question in that process to a certain extent, because that's super interesting what you're thinking, what you're envisaging. It would be great to go that way, but I think there's still some ground to cover in terms of what kind of framework needs to be in place in order to facilitate that. So let me share my screen. All right. You can see my screen, all right? It's the first time I'm using Google Slides to present, so I hope that works. Okay, so what I wanted to do briefly was just to give a bit more strength to saying, okay, we've given theoretical arguments why the inflexibility critique of algorithmic contracts is actually not that strong. But I think the other really, or maybe the even stronger answer to that is we can see empirical evidence that that claim is at least partially incorrect or is contradicted by empirical evidence. Now, why? We go to algorithmic trading on financial markets. And what I'm showing here is a data from 2017. And what you can see is that back in 2017, almost 70% of trades in equities on exchanges, on stock exchanges, we're talking about stock, were already automated. That number is probably much higher by now. And so at least when we talk about financial instruments, the share of trades that are executed by algorithms only is rising and is extremely high for certain types of financial instruments. Now, what exactly is algorithmic trading? We have a definition of it in our Market in Financial Instruments Directive from the EU. So the directive says that trading in financial instruments is where a computer algorithm automatically determines individual parameters of orders with limited or no human intervention. So that can relate to price, that can relate to quantity, to the time in which you buy and sell, and so forth. And it excludes dumb algorithms that just route orders, so that just decide where an order on which venue it's going to be placed. Is that a good definition of algorithmic trading? Meh. So there's a really nice paper by Clara Matilde Pereira that Helen mentioned that makes very clear that it's not a good idea to exclude routing algorithms, the dumb ones, because they can cause a lot of damage, and that having limited human intervention within the definition also makes no sense because those markets are truly automated. Okay, so now we come to the question of Leo. The case study that we're addressing on the spot exchanges. So when a certain amount of shares switches hand for a certain amount of money in return. Now, is that a contract in the legal sense? Because economists say, well, you know, that is not something that is very interesting to us because we always like to have a kind of temporal dimension in a contract, something more in the longer term in order to think about interesting economic problems. We'll get to that. Now, if we think about the definition of what a contract is, if we look, for example, at the principles of European contract law, a contract is simply concluded if the parties intend to be legally bound and if they reach a sufficient agreement without any further requirement. Is that the case on financial markets? Yes, we have offer and acceptance and the exchange and the settlement. Do the parties intend to be legally bound? Yes, they want to have a sale, right? So in that sense, we do not think that there's a great obstacle of classifying algorithmic trading as a form of algorithmic contracting, right? So that's why we think that our case study has validity. Now, at the same time, we have that critique that when you use algorithms to coordinate transactions, they would form two types of inflexibility, and therefore we should not really see such a widespread use, but we're seeing it on financial markets. Now, how is it? Is it because it's frictionless? No, we have had huge instances of kind of systemic problems with algorithmic trading, right? We had big flash crash in 2010, where all of a sudden within 36 minutes, the Dow Jones lost 1,000 points. We've had scandals like with Knight Capital, where a wrongly performing algorithm was essentially caused huge losses to this investment firm. So no, it has not worked frictionless, but we have a very dense regulatory framework around it, at least in the European Union, but also in the US, we have regulation of algorithmic trading. And that includes regulating the traders themselves, specific forms of algorithmic trading. So if you're using high frequency trading, you will get additional regulatory obligations, and the venues that allow for algorithmic trading are also regulated, right? And the regulatory burden is heavy. So you have the stress testing of algorithms by the trader, by the trading venue, reporting obligation to financial supervisory authorities. You have to have algorithmic supervision system of the algorithmic trading systems. You have to design your algorithms in certain ways. They cannot sell faster than at that rate. They need to have a kill switch. So you need to be able to kind of shut down your algorithm as soon as it starts going crazy. So the burden is huge. Now, what happens if there's no regulatory framework? So what would be if we have a kind of market where algorithms conclude transactions, but we don't have that heavy regulatory framework? Now, we do have a case from a cryptocurrency exchange in Singapore that addresses that question. And the answer is to apply general contract law to the transaction. And that in itself can cause problems. So to give an example about a concrete case where you had, I mean, it's still very much in the financial kind of sector, but it's unregulated, right? So you had a cryptocurrency exchange, Coin, that had implemented or had not updated an algorithm that introduced into the platform market prices for cryptocurrencies. So that algorithm was showing some weird prices that did not reflect the prices on the real market. And Coin had a clause in its contract for the users of the cryptocurrency exchange that no transaction would ever be reversed. So they had an irreversibility clause in their user contract or terms and conditions. So when that program that imported market prices malfunctioned, what happened is that Bitcoin and Ether were traded between a company called B2C2 at totally weird prices. So one Ether was exchanged for 3 Bitcoin or something totally outrageous. So for those that are a bit into cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin is much more valuable than Ether. So what happened is that a certain company that had an algorithm deciding on the trades gained a lot of money, and other people lost a lot of money in those trades because they were conducted on information that was wrongly provided by the platform. Now, what happened is that Coin reversed those transactions when it realized that there had been a mistake. And what actually happened is that the parties went to court because they said, no, this transaction was correct. And you said that you would not reverse transactions, so we want to keep the trades as they were. And the question was, well, does the doctrine of mistake apply here? Because the algorithm by this B2C2 firm had implemented a trading strategy that was totally unrealistic, because that kind of market exchange was not to be expected. And what the court came to is that there was no mistake, because the programmer, at the moment that he implemented that kind of algorithm, would have had to know that somebody else would mistakenly enter into a trade with the company if the market prices were shown in a crazy fashion. So the court eventually said that the cryptocurrency exchange was actually in breach of its own contract, because it had an irreversibility clause, and asked the trades to be back, even though they were conducted on completely wrong market prices. And that raised a whole lot of questions about whether the doctrine of mistake, thinking about the subjective state of mind of the programmer that had programmed the algorithm months before, was actually correct standard here, which shows that maybe traditional contract law has struggles in order to come to correct solutions in the case of algorithmic contracts and the transaction concluded by algorithmic contracts. I want to end here with saying that at the end of the day, if we think about contract automation, algorithmic contracts, and whether their inflexibilities make them irrelevant, or whether the systemic risks that result from them are too high, they raise the question of whether we need a certain regulatory framework for them. And for example, if they would be used in public procurement, you probably couldn't go ahead, but you would need to think about what would happen in instances of malfunctioning and other problems that might not be solved by the algorithms themselves, and might need to have external intervention at regulatory level. And why did we use Williamson here? Not because of Williamson's kind of organizational contract theory, but because Williamson stands a bit like the godfather of new institutional economics, and he points us to the fact that whenever something changes in one of the levels at which you can study social interaction, so for example, in governance, you change the technology to contract, that might mean that you need to have adaptations at the formal institutional level. So at the level of policies, regulations, and so forth. And that's the kind of bottom line of our paper. And I'll stop here, and I hope that I was still in time. So thanks so much. And I hope I addressed some of the questions.
Thank you so much, Maria Jose. Yeah, we are almost on time. There is a question by Marta to Helen. I don't know if Helen, you had a chance to see the question. I can read the first part if you want to address it fast, and then we will have to close. It says, Helen, I'm sorry, I think Helen mentioned that regulation might not be necessary when private costs until they do not become externalities. But how to sustain the added value of inflexibility when talking about unfair clauses? I'm thinking here on the situation created in Spain and other countries with floor clauses in mortgage loan contracts.
Yes, so thank you, Marta, for the question. I think that to some extent, what Maria said now, after posing the question, already addressed it. So Maria, if you would like to follow up on Marta's question, I think that would be great as well. But in any case, well, I think the conclusion here is that while the financial markets address the systemic risks on those markets mainly, in case of algorithmic contracting, we might want to consider whether there are systemic risks that we can address, or we actually need to pay more attention to how the general contract law is able to address the questions where inflexibility plays, the situations where inflexibility plays a huge role. And the case that Maria presented shows that general contract law currently is not able to respond well to such cases. So we might need to rethink the general contract law. Maria, would you like to add anything on this?
No, I think that's basically it. Yeah.
Okay.
It's definitely worthy of a next discussion.
Well, okay. Thank you so much, Helen and Maria Jose. Thank you so much for your presentations, for the exchange, for the insightful discussion. And yeah, as Helen and Maria Jose said, we can do another workshop to continue discussing. No, it felt short in a way, but thank you so much for joining us. And well, have a good evening, everyone. And we hope to see you again for our next session, October 28th. Caterina Scanga will be with us talking about the future of IP inflexibilities. So you're all welcome to join us.
Thank you so much.
Congratulations.
It's been great being here. And I can say about Caterina a few words of advertisement because Caterina and I are part of a project, the Horizon 2020 project, Recreating Europe. And we're actually building a new proposal, which Maria is part of as well for Horizon Europe. So it's an ongoing work and it's really been very productive. So I'm definitely going to be there myself and I hope you all will be as well.
Amazing. Very glad you're joining. Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much again and have a good evening.